You're welcome to our lecture series on chordates. Today's lecture will be on the internal anatomy and physiology of the amphibians. Earlier in the internal anatomy and physiology, we had discussed about the skeletal system as well as the nervous and circulatory systems. So in our lecture today, we will look at the digestive system and other anatomical and physiological features of the amphibians. First, let's look at the digestive system of the amphibians. The digestive system of the amphibians. Many amphibians, the digestive system of the amphibians, just as it is with other tetrapod vertebrates, basically consists of the mouth, the esophagus, the stomach, the intestines, and the anus. And basically, the amphibians are known to feed by preying on some lower organisms, like some feed on some insects and some feed on both aquatic and terrestrial insects and tiny fishes. Many amphibians catch their prey by flicking out an elongated tongue with a sticky tip and drawing it back into the mouth before seizing the item with the jaws. Some use inertia feeding to help them swallow their prey. That's they repeatedly thrust their heads forward sharply, causing the food to move backwards in their mouth by inertia. Because they are unable to swallow the food directly, they have to be thrusting their heads forward and backward, and that moves the food into the esophagus and down to the stomach. Most amphibians swallow their prey whole without much chewing, so they possess voluminous stomachs. The short esophagus is lined with cilia that help to move the food to the stomach, and mucus produced by glands in the mouth and pharynx eases its passage. So they have cilia. The cilia, the beating of the cilia, directs the food to the stomach, and mucus, which is slimy, helps the food to slip through the esophagus into the stomach. The amphibians produce enzymes in their digestive system. The enzyme chitinase produced in the stomach helps digest the chitinous cuticle of arthropod prey. When they feed on arthropods, such as the insects and other arthropods, the chitinase that's produced in the stomach helps to digest the chitinous exoskeleton of the arthropods. Amphibians possess pancreas, liver, and gallbladder in their digestive system. The liver is usually large with two lobes. Its size is determined by its function as a glycogen and fat storage unit, and may change with seasons as these reserves are built or used up. So the size of the liver is as a result of the fact that the liver is responsible for the storage of glycogen and fat. Now, this is the digestive system of the amphibians, of a frog. Now, in this figure, we'll see the stomach that's very extensive. Then also have the intestines and the anus. So the food comes in through the mouth, and after swallowing, it's helped by cilia and the mucus in the esophagus that helps to make the food to slip through the esophagus down to the stomach, which is very extensive because they swallow their prey whole. And digestion of the food, chitinase, the enzyme chitinase, is being released, which helps to break down the chitinous exoskeleton in the arthropods, like the insects that have been eaten. And then the food is being assimilated in the intestines and then undigested food substances are passed out or are defecated through the anus. Now I want to look at the excretory system of the amphibians. The amphibians possess two kidneys located dorsally near the roof of the body cavity, just as it is with mammals and birds, particularly in mammals that have two kidneys. The amphibians also have two kidneys. The jobs of the kidneys is to filter the blood of metabolic waste, as it is with other tetrapods, and transport the urine via ureters to the urinary bladder, where it is stored before being passed out periodically through the cloacal vent. So there's one difference between the amphibians and that of the reptiles and birds. The amphibians, they possess urinary bladder, and the urine is actually produced and passed out through the cloacal vent. There are some reptiles that lack urinary bladder, and some birds also, but the amphibians have a urinary bladder that temporarily stores this urinary waste. Larvae and most aquatic adult amphibians excrete the nitrogen as ammonia. The larval amphibians and some aquatic amphibians produce ammonia as their excretory wastes in large quantities of dilute urine, while terrestrial species with a greater need to conserve water excrete the less toxic product urea. Okay, so they produce, the adults that are terrestrial produce urea, while the aquatic ones produce ammonia. Some tree frogs with limited access to water excrete most of their metabolic waste as uric acid. Now here is the digestive system, the excretory system of the amphibians. Like I said earlier, the excretory system of the amphibians consists of two kidneys that are dorsally placed, that are close to their back, and these kidneys are responsible for the removal of metabolic wastes. And once the urea is produced, in the case of the adults, it is stored in the urinary bladder temporarily through gets to the urinary bladder through the ureter, and then is voided out through the cloacal vent or the cloacal aperture. Now I want to look at the respiratory system of the amphibians. Now, the amphibians, because of their biphasal life, or because of their metamorphosis, they exhibit two systems of, in fact, they respire through three means. They respire through the gills in the tadpole stage. The tadpole mix of the external gills in the water, and then when the gills are internalized, the use of the internal gills and the skin. So the use of gills is gill respiration, and they also make use of the skin, which is the cutaneous respiration. And then as adults, they make use of their lungs instead of gills, which is pulmonary respiration, while they also make use of the skin too as adults, but some also make use of their mouth for respiration, which is buccal respiration. So as juveniles, they make use of gill and cutaneous respiration, but as adults, they make use of cutaneous, which is skin respiration, pulmonary, which is lung respiration, and mouth, which is buccal respiration. The lungs in amphibians are primitive compared to those of amniotes, possessing few internal septa and large alveoli, and consequently have a comparatively low diffusion rate for oxygen entering the blood. So their lungs usually are different from those of other amniotes, like the reptiles, birds, and the mammals. The alveoli are large and they have few internal septa. The alveoli are where gaseous exchange take place. Okay, and though they tend to have slow diffusion rate of oxygen that's entering the body, ventilation is accomplished by buccal pumping. The ventilation that takes place in the amphibians is facilitated by the movement, the lower and upward movement of the lower part of the mouth. As the mouth moves up and down, it helps to bring in oxygen. When it moves down, oxygen is drawn in. When it goes up, it pushes the oxygen down to carbon dioxide is exhaled. So buccal pumping is what helps. In contrast to the reptiles that use thoracic breathing and mammals that have diaphragm that facilitates breathing. But in amphibians, ventilation is achieved through buccal pumping. Most amphibians, however, are able to exchange gases with the water or air via their skin. That's cutaneous respiration. They carry out cutaneous respiration. So we have talked about pulmonary respiration, where the lungs are used for respiration. And to ventilate the lungs, they carry out buccal pumping. The mouth, the lower part of the mouth, as it moves up and down, it helps in respiration. When it goes down, it draws in oxygen. And then when it goes up, carbon dioxide is exhaled. To enable sufficient cutaneous respiration, the surface of their highly vascularized skin must remain moist to allow the oxygen to diffuse at a sufficiently high rate. So that's why the skins of amphibians are usually moist. The moist skin help greater surface area, facilitates the surface area of the skin to enhance diffusion of oxygen into the blood capillaries. Because oxygen concentration in the water increases at both low temperatures and high flow rates, aquatic amphibians in these situations can rely primarily on cutaneous respiration, as in the Titicaca water frog and the hellbender salamander. So those that are mainly aquatic, they would have to depend more on cutaneous respiration. Those aquatic species tend to depend more on the skin respiration. Now, those that are, when they are on land in air, where oxygen is more concentrated, some small species can rely solely on cutaneous gas exchange. Some small species of amphibians can depend solely on the skin for gaseous exchange. Most famously, the plathodontid salamanders, which have neither lungs nor gills. The plathodontid salamanders do not have lungs or gills entirely. So they depend entirely on this cutaneous respiration. They depend entirely on their skin for respiration. Many aquatic salamanders and all tadpoles have gills in their larval stage, with some, such as the axolotl, retaining gills as aquatic adults. So many aquatic larval stages make use of gills for respiration. But there's a particular species of amphibian that's called the axolotl that make use of gills entirely, even as adults, for respiration. Now here is a figure that's showing the process of respiration in the amphibians. The amphibians have a nostril and they have the mouth, which is the buccal cavity, and then the lungs that are parts of the pulmonary respiration. Now, when the lower part of the mouth is lowered, when it's expanded, oxygen is drawn in and it ventilates the lungs. is drawn into the buccal cavity. And then when it is compressed, the air is then moved into the lungs. Okay, the air is then moved into the lungs to ventilate the lungs. The oxygen is used up, and then carbon dioxide is released. Now here is a figure that's showing the cutaneous respiration of the amphibians. Here's the skin surface, the epidermis, and oxygen diffuses into the blood to oxygenate the capillaries, while carbon dioxide diffuses out. And to achieve this, the skin would have to be moist all the time. Now I want to look at reproduction in amphibians. Reproduction. Most amphibians, especially frogs and toads, carry out external fertilization. Fertilization is accomplished externally, where the male would have to swim, be on top of the female, and then while as the male is releasing the eggs, the female is also simultaneously releasing, as the male is releasing the sperm, the female is also simultaneously releasing the eggs, and fertilization takes place externally, and the eggs are left floating in the water until they hatch. After fertilization, the eggs hatch into miniature tadpoles in about a month. The tadpoles typically have oval bodies and long vertically flattened tails with fins. So after about a month of fertilization, the eggs hatch into miniature tadpoles that are like fish and live in the water. And at that stage, their anatomical and physiological features are entirely different from the adult amphibians. Mating. This figure is showing how this mating occurs. This is the male amphibian, and this is a female, and external fertilization takes place. The female releases eggs, while the male produces sperm that fertilizes the egg, okay, as they carry out this copulation. And the fertilized eggs usually have a transparent covering and a black sport, which forms the embryo, as seen floating on the surface of the water body. The tadpoles of the amphibians are normally fully aquatic, but the tadpoles of some species, such as Nanophris silonensis, are semi-terrestrial and live among wet rocks. They live among wet rocks. Tadpoles have cartilaginous skeletons. Gills are for respiration. They possess external gills first, and then later develop internal gills. The external gills becomes internalized. The external gills of the tadpoles become internalized. They also possess lateral lines and large tails that are used for swimming. So one very distinctive feature of the amphibians, the tadpole amphibians, is that they make use of gills for respiration. They're like fish. They have lateral line system for detection of vibration and pressure, temperature and pressure and vibration, while they also possess tails that have fins for swimming. Newly hatched tadpoles soon develop gill pouches that cover the gills. They use gills for respiration, and they also employ cutaneous respiration. The lungs develop early and are used as accessory breathing organs. The tadpoles rise into the water surface to gulp air. So when they develop the lungs, they now begin to come up to the surface to gulp air. They are now gradually metamorphosing into the adult form. While the tadpoles do not have true teeth, in most species, the jaws have long parallel rows of small keratinized structures called keratons, surrounded by a horny beak. So those keratinized structures help them to scrape off algae and other substances from the water as tadpoles. Tadpoles are typically herbivorous, feeding mostly on algae, including diatoms filtered from the water through the gills. They are herbivorous. The tadpoles are usually herbivorous. They feed on algae, and which also include diatoms, and they filter them through the gills. They are also detritivores. Detritivores are organisms that feed on dead, decomposing organic matter. They are also detritivores, stirring up the sediment at the bottom, at the pond bottom, and ingesting edible fragments. So they feed on the decomposing plant parts in the water. They have a relatively long spiral-shaped gut to enable them to digest this diet. They have a long spiral-shaped gut, digestive system that enables them to digest the plants, that the algae that they are feeding on, and the detritus. Some species are carnivorous at the tadpole stage, eating insects, smaller tadpoles, and fish. Some tadpoles are carnivorous. They feed on insects, particularly aquatic insects, and they also feed on small tadpoles and fish. The young of the Cuban tree frog can occasionally be cannibalistic. The young tadpoles attacking a larger, more developed tadpole when it is undergoing metamorphosis. At metamorphosis, rapid changes in the body take place as the lifestyle of the tadpole changes completely. At metamorphosis, changes actually take place in the amphibians, and it transforms from one form to the other. The spiral-shaped mouth with horny teeth ridges is reabsorbed together with the spiral gut. The animal develops a large jaw, and its gills disappears along with its gill sac. The gills now disappear, and they now begin to make use of lungs instead. Eyes and legs grow quickly, and a tongue is formed. From legs and front legs are formed under the gill sac, and hind legs become visible a few days later. All this can happen in a number of days. In about a day. A few days later, the tail is reabsorbed due to the high thyroxine concentration required for this to take place, and the tadpole fully develops into an adult frog or toad. So basically, these are the transformations that take place. The front legs are formed, and the hind legs are also formed, and this happens in about a day. And later, the tail is also reabsorbed. The tail, particularly in the tailless amphibians, in the order Anura, the frogs and the toads, the tail is actually absorbed. Now, this is the figure that's demonstrating the metamorphosis of amphibians, the metamorphosis that takes place in the amphibians. Now, in the first stage, the eggs of the leopard frog, are laid after fertilization, and then they develop into tadpoles. The tadpoles B and C in about a month. The tadpole gradually develop limbs and begin to lose their tails. That's figure D. Then in D and E. Then in F, in the next month or two, the adult F is formed. The adult now fully develops. Now I want to look at estivation by amphibians. Some amphibians estivate during the hot, dry season by moving on the ground where it is cooler and more humid. They estivate. How do they do that? They bury themselves in the ground in a secreted watertight cocoon during periods of hot, dry weather. When the weather is hot and dry, when there's no water in the pond or pool where they find themselves, they hibernate, they secrete a watertight cocoon, and they live inside that, they remain in that cocoon throughout the dry season. This is what happens when the area is dry. They now dig and bury themselves and secrete cocoon and remain in a state of inactivity throughout the dry season. They hibernate, and this process is called hibernation. So that's how far we can go in our lecture today. Thanks a lot for watching. Now, next lecture, we'll look at the reptiles.